I'm Bob Harris of Decorative Concrete Institute. Welcome to Duramin's training and educational series for industrial and decorative flooring systems. We're about to start our grinding, honing, and polishing phases on the Param 6000 here. Oftentimes we get asked, how do you know how hard or how soft the surface is? Now, this material was poured yesterday. It's not even 24 hours, so it's not fully cured. But how do we know? So we're going to do a test. This is called a Mohs hardness pencil scratch test. And basically, 0 or 1 would be considered talc, and diamond is the hardest mineral produced known to man, would be a 9. Traditional concrete scratches somewhere between 4 to 7. Anything less than 4 is considered kind of soft. And why is that important? It's important because you need to know where to start on your grit sequence here. This is what's referred to as a double segment metal bond, and then the brown represents the grit, which is 80 grit. So get with the diamond tooling manufacturer, and they should have a grinding guide chart that tells you the appropriate diamond to use relative to the hardness of the surface. This is, again, not even 24 hours old, so I'm going to use a double segment, which displaces the head pressure. You can get this in a single segment, which is more head pressure because all the weight, the down pressure is on that one segment. So I think this is going to be a good starting point. What we're trying to do is cut off the cap or cut off the paste of the surface here, and we've embedded some decorative aggregates, so we need to get a uniform exposure. So let's just go through the series here. So this is a 2, which is doing nothing. This is a 3, which is pretty much doing nothing. Here's a 4. It kind of skipped, so it gave it a little scratch, and here is a 5. And it appears that it's a distinct scratch. So if I was evaluating the surface, I would call this a 4.5. It did not scratch all the way here at a 4, but it did scratch all the way here at a 5. So I would consider this a 4.5. But again, the material's not fully cured. Had we given this one more day, probably would have scratched it at least a 6, if not more. So I've chosen the appropriate diamond relative to the hardness of the surface. Even with that, it's important to not just go and assume that that's the right diamond. Go ahead and do a small sample test, perhaps on 10 square feet or so, and turn the machine off and evaluate the surface. You don't want to go too deep, and certainly you've got to break the cap off and get down into the sands. So we're going to demonstrate how to start our grinding process. HTC has provided us with hand edging tools. These are some really unique tools. They're referred to as diamond segmented cup wheels, basically, but what's nice about it is they're excellent for addressing the edges. That's a super important part of this whole process, is doing nice clean edges. And so what we would do, theoretically, we would go around each time we make a pass. You can see we've got a brown double segment here. Well, we would start on the edges with the brown cup wheel, and then we would also go up the progression. Black would represent 100 grit, blue would represent 200 grit, and then after the 200 grit, we would typically switch over to a Phoenix pad. So we're going to demonstrate. We finished our first initial cut. We did the double segmented 80 metal bond diamond. Joe went around the edges. Everything looks great. I see a very nice uniform sand exposure. And we've got our decorative aggregate over here, which looks great. Everything is flush and uniform. It's not unlikely, especially on a large project, sometimes you may get some minor pitting or perhaps an aggregate gets dislodged. Duramin recommends that you use CP1000. You can go over to the dust extractor, obtain the dust from the vacuum, and you could, in essence, make up a slurry skim coat. If you do that, you need to skim coat the whole floor. So you can't just go and skim coat an isolated area because it darkens the substrate. So make sure that you have to commit to skim coating the whole floor. Minimum 2 to 3 hours, you'd want that skim coat to dry, okay? And then once you've done that, the stage that we're at right here, we've vacuumed and we've damp mopped. On a large job, you would auto scrub the floor, so there's no dust particulate on the floor whatsoever. And now the next step is to densify. We may change up the process if we were using a die. especially if we were using a water-based dye. We would not be densifying right now. We would be densifying after the dye was applied. So with this type of colloidal silica, basically you want to keep the surface saturated for a minimum of 20 minutes. I see a lot of people just put a mist coat of densifier down on the surface and microfiber pad it in, and it's dry within 2 to 3 minutes. That's not truly densifying a floor. You want to keep it saturated for a good 25 to 30 minutes, completely to where it's saturated out, where it's standing on the surface, and let that dry. I do like to, after the densifier has been applied, auto scrub the floor or damp mop it just to get any residual crystallization off the surface that could possibly load up on your diamonds. And if you over densify and you get that loading up on your diamonds, meaning you don't clean the floor first, it'll kaleidoscope the floor. You'll see little swirls, and it's because it's a densifier load up on the diamonds. So just be very thorough on cleaning in between steps. What I'm going to do here is simply spray apply it. And you can see how quickly it's absorbing in. This is densifier. No, we've already cleaned it. On our Param 6000, we started off with the grinding phase using a double segment 80 grit metal bond diamond. The bond of the diamond was for medium to medium hard concrete. And then we cleaned the surface and we applied densifier to refusal. So what that means is we saturated the surface for 30 minutes. Again, this is not even 24 hours old, so I'm trying to harden the surface up during the process. Once we allowed the surface to stay saturated for 30 minutes, it dried out, and we just ran a damp mop over it. I just want to get any crystallized residue that didn't penetrate off of the surface so it doesn't end up on our diamond tooling. Our next step is to use what's called a transitional resin, and in this case what we're using is an HTC 100 big block. So what we're doing is we're taking the scratches out from the previous grit, which is an 80 grit. Now normally on traditional concrete you're going to always jump back a grit. So what I mean by that is we would go 80 grit, perhaps 150 grit, and then our transition would go backwards to a 100 grit. But because of the fineness of the sands in this material and how nicely the big blocks work, we're not dropping backwards. So we're switching to a transitional, and then once this is complete, we'll address the edges, and after that we switch to what's called a Phoenix pad, which we'll demonstrate. Each grit, I'm bumping the speed or the RPM of the machine up at least a half a speed or 1 notch. So we started at a 3. I changed the speed dial to a 4 right now. So I'm going to just lightly de-weight the head pressure and get going. Turn the vacuum on. On our Param 6000 self-leveling application, we started with 80 grit double segment metals, and then we switched to a transitional big block 100 grit. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to use an HTC Phoenix pad. These are really unique pads, and it's part of the solution for polishing overlays. It really works nicely. This is a 200 grit. The blue represents 200. We'll then switch to red, which is the 400 grit, followed by the white 800 grit, and then we'll do the last grit of the Phoenix pad that we'll do a yellow, which is 1500 grit. Now, self-leveling cements are very porous and they're very prone to absorbing too quickly. So what we'll do is we'll put 2 coats of a topical guard over that, and then we'll burnish it with a diamond impregnated pad, referred to as a dip pad. Generally, we'll use a 3000 grit dip pad. And we should have a real nice gloss, and we'll actually bring out a gloss meter to talk about what a gloss meter or a DOI meter is, and we'll show you the meters relative to this floor. To recap, I'm going to bump the speed up of the machine 1 notch each time, each grit. We've just completed the blue 200 grit Phoenix pad produced by HTC, and we evaluated the floor. Prior to running the 200 grit, the blue, there was a few minor scratches left on the surface from the big block, the transitional that we did. The 100s have completely removed every scratch off this surface. It's pretty amazing technology. I'm actually even only at 200 grit, and with the light refracting over here, I can actually start to see a shine. So now we're switching over to the 400 grit Phoenix pad, which is the red pad. And to recap, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the speed dial up 1 notch. So we've gone from the grinding phase, and now we're going to what's called the honing stage. After the next grit, we'll actually be polishing the surface. We completed our 400 grit, the red Phoenix pads. Joe went around the edges, caught all the edges up, scratch-free. Once again, that's the whole goal. You're just removing scratches from the previous grit. Now we're going with the white Phoenix pad, and that is an 800 grit. I've already bumped the speed of the machine up 1 notch. That's important to keep remembering to advance the speed up. And now we're going to get going on this. Now look, it's difficult to work on such a small panel, so normally what I want to do is I want to run an east or a north and an east pass, meaning up and back in the same pass, and run all that grit that path, that way, that direction. And then when we switch grits, preferably we'd want to go perpendicular, north and south. And I see a lot of, in the industry, unfortunately, some of the newer generation, I see a lot of line striping on floors, and it's a direct result of not enough overlap on your machine. So especially when you're learning, go ahead and do a complete half overlap on the machine, and you won't stripe your floor. We're nearing the end of all of our steps on the Param 6000 polishable overlay. Now what we're doing is we're running the yellow Phoenix pad, which is a 1500 grit. Again, I bump up the speed for the final time. I'm up to roughly 8.5 on the speed dial. Gently set it down, and we're ready to go.